Shalom, shalom, my Abiram, and greetings, my YouTube Mishpaha, and welcome back to Bible on a Bicycle. Dang it!
Ready to talk about the Facade. I'd always wanted to try writing a novel. So when I got through my PhD exams, our department, a lot of the people in our department, there was sort of an unspoken tradition that once you passed your exams, you sort of took a year off. There were guys who would tinker at their house or tinker at their car, and I thought, well, I'm going to write a novel. That's what I'm going to do, just because I was kind of burned out. So I had a good job. To do that, I worked late night, third shift as a security guard. That's what I did going through grad school. One of about 3 or 4 jobs anyway. So I had long chunks of time, and I thought, well, I'm going to take the first year, what should be my dissertation, and do something fun. So that's what I decided to do. I figured, I've always been interested in paranormal stuff. I got seriously interested in UFO stuff in 1997. I had been interested up to that point, but that was sort of a watershed year for me. And so I thought, well, let's throw all this stuff into the blender, so to speak, and see what comes out. I had a command of ancient texts. I knew a good bit about the UFO stuff. I mean, I was a regular listener to Coast, so I was sort of up to date on all the crazy conspiracy, kinds of talk. And I thought, why not? Let's just throw it all in there and see what comes out. And I wanted it to be, I wanted everything in the book to be factual. In other words, I could trace it somewhere to, credible research material. And so that was the approach, the tactic. But then, of course, the story was, made up, essentially how I connected all those dots. And it was fun. I mean, to this day, it is the most fun thing I do is to write fiction. There's a sequel out now to The Facade, but I'm really looking forward to doing number 3 because it really is fun. It's a diversion for me. For the sequel, I wasn't sure. It took a long time to produce a sequel because I had to go back to my dissertation. Then I had a real job and whatnot, and I wasn't sure that I could pull off a sequel because I didn't have the long stretches of time. So the real question was, can you do this in like hour-long segments? Is that possible? Because I hadn't done it that way before, so I had to sort of retrain myself to do number 2. I more or less just decided, well, I have to make a file because I kind of liked the idea of not only at the chapter headings I wanted to use quotes, but somewhere there are occasions within the context of the story that's useful. So yeah, I've collected a good number of them. In terms of the Facade, there were certain descriptions, of like the cattle mutilation thing that I thought were really kind of astonishing, very surprising. So I would say some of that stuff, there are a few, again, suggestive quotes that I thought were real eye-catching that I didn't expect. I have a different context for those now, and the reader might as well once they're through the second book. But I mean, they're there. That stuff's out there. You can find it and track it down, and what you make of it, of course, is why I used it. That it's not something that is really easily explainable. So it was really good fodder, for what I was doing. The government is not above manipulating citizens to propel a certain narrative or a certain misdirection. And so, in the book, you are confronted with real things, but then the reader is also confronted with, well, what we thought was this, maybe it's that. And there's a lot of that in the Facade, which of course is why it gets the name that it gets, because there are competing intelligences, let's just put it that way, that are trying to move the herd in different directions, and that the greater evil intelligence is using the lesser ones, but that only the reader knows that. The characters don't know that. So the reader actually gets a more in-depth glimpse of how the Facade is working and what the Facade actually is, moving the reader toward those directions. And those sorts of things, like Mirage Men, they happen in real time, in our own situation. And for a novel like The Facade, they're very illustrative and useful, again, to just get across the thought that, well, what you thought this is might not be what it is. What you think may not be so, that sort of thing. I don't read much fiction, but I was a big fan of the X-Files and shows like that. I like misdirection, so I wanted to make that a heavy component of the story. And there's lots of misdirection in the Facade. And as far as the storyline goes, I thought, well, what better premise, to sort of start off with, it would be, what would the impact be on, traditional conservative, quote unquote, Bible believing Christianity if a genuine extraterrestrial disclosure happened, something that was basically undeniable. And so that became the orienting focus of the story. And the main character, who's basically me, I did that because I'd never written fiction before, so I had to know somebody. I had to know one character at least in the novel. And so Brian, the lead character, is basically me when I was in college, those sort of years, with all his insecurities and whatnot. So I wanted to confront him with that question, and he becomes again the main focus that sort of propels the story. And then it morphs at one point to, well, what if we thought and we had demonstrated to us was a genuine disclosure? What if it wasn't? What if it was something worse? At least potentially. And so those two thoughts, are what propel the story. One at the beginning, and then you have this transition and this, there's this disagreement. People don't quite know what to do with what they were told as they work their way through the story. He's basically abducted by a couple of guys. Agents, sort of men in black kind of figures. And he does, obviously he's so out of place in this. He doesn't have a job. He's just, he's made it through graduate school. His parents have been murdered. He's basically going nowhere. He doesn't really have much of a future. And why he would be a subject of interest really to anyone for anything is kind of a conundrum to him. But he finds out that the connection is a professor he had while he was in college, that sort of a mentor figure for him. And he's a pretty isolated person, Brian is. And so that sort of gets sorted out as to why he was chosen to do this particular thing that his friend is involved with. His friend is very highly placed in the intelligence community. He was a political science professor. And so that's how he gets drawn into the whole set of circumstances. Andrew, Father Benedict, was sort of my nod to Malachi Martin, very famous Jesuit scholar, and he was a legit scholar. I've seen his dissertation, one of them anyway. And so I wanted to, again, have this little nod, to Martin, and I thought I would use Benedict to do that, because Benedict prods Brian to certain conclusions that Benedict suspects, and Brian is a bit hesitant to sort of go there. And so I wanted to use that relationship to try to, move Brian along, not in a suspicious way, but of course, in the story, you don't really know if he's going off in the wrong direction or if he's heading in the right direction. Yeah, but Benedict was very useful for that, and Benedict is sort of, other than the political science guy who's kind of in a leadership role, Benedict is the one who essentially becomes, Brian's friend. I mean, he makes other friends in the group, but he's the immediate connection because of their religious background. And Benedict is familiar with Brian's work, which Brian thinks is just like, boy, I didn't know I didn't think anybody had ever read anything I did. and his connection, of course, not only to Benedict, but also to the other fellow, Neil Banstra, is an article he wrote about the implications of extraterrestrial life for, again, the conservative, Bible believer. Brian had been teaching at a Bible college right out of grad school, and this article leads to him getting fired. And so he has no future. He's basically going nowhere, but his conversations with Neil, again, his old professor from Johns Hopkins, really struck a nerve with Neil when Neil is drawn into this sort of dark, murky, black op world, and the extraterrestrial question gets put on the table. Brian is the first person he thinks of that could help him think well about what he's been, thrown into. There's a character who gets, meets an unfortunate end, Mantello, Father Mantello, who's an astronomer, who is a real person, by the way, not a priest, but in fact, as we speak here, a week ago, I had another meeting with Mantello. So again, there's a real person behind that who does what Mantello does in real life. But I wanted to, again, acknowledge that they are ahead of the curve, but Benedict is someone who, again, he's a Jesuit, and so he's well aware of this. And Benedict has a lot going on in his own history. But again, that's my nod to Martin. Benedict is very suspicious of the authority structures in the church. He does believe that they have been infected by darkness. And so he's also there for that reason, to help Brian potentially, again, navigate who his friends might be and who to look out for. That sort of thing. But you don't really know a whole lot about Benedict in the story. And as the story goes on, you start to learn more and more. And the reader is led to think, well, what about this guy? Melissa's very hostile. And again, the reader eventually learns where that comes from. But she is very condescending. She's cruel to him in particular. She has, some serious anger issues, and again, because of her own history. And she is not only personally and professionally antagonistic to him, but she also is Melissa's a good thinker. She's a good character for one who would suspend judgment. And even when Brian takes a turn in this or that direction, Melissa is there to sort of keep him in check, sometimes in a conscious or an unconscious way, but she has really no time at all for him or for Brian or what he stands for. There's another quote in the book from someone named Donna Hare who talks about UFOs being regularly airbrushed out of photos before they were publicly released. Mm-hmm. And these are real people, who worked at NASA. They see things, they hear things, they think things on the basis of what they see, hear, and think. They draw their own conclusions. The real question in my mind with all of that sort of stuff is, are they processing the reality behind what they're hearing, seeing correctly? To me, it always comes down to that. Maybe what's being airbrushed out, okay, it is an unidentified flying object, but does that mean it's extraterrestrial? Well, if you ask Donna Hare, she would have that suspicion, because why else are you airbrushing them out of photos? And there could be other explanations, but she and the UFO community are going to go one particular direction with that. Somebody else would go a different direction with that. But yeah, it's all that sort of matrix of real lore when it comes to NASA and UFOs, and I would say what else is up there that the public is being shielded from. Again, it can go a couple of different directions, all of which are fascinating. And that, again, that's just good material for a book like The Facade. The quote's in there because that is a particular Bible myth that I think really needs to be disposed of for all sorts of reasons. It's very poor thinking to think, again, in its most simplistic terms, that it can't be real unless it's mentioned in the Bible. Well, toilet paper is real, okay? Right. We know about planets beyond Saturn, and nobody in the ancient world, knew that for sure. We know about microwaves. We know about how germs travel through the bloodstream. I mean, there are just tens of thousands of things that are demonstrably real that are not in the Bible. So if that's your mentality about the Bible, you're thinking very poorly. And in a lot of these examples that I just gave, they're fairly trivial. But there are really important things that if you take that same approach to the Bible, and of course in the case of the book, it's about, are there extraterrestrials? Mm-hmm. There are some really big picture things that are really important that, to use the same approach, the same hermeneutic, could potentially set you up for a fall as a Bible believer and set the Bible up, make it vulnerable to ridicule. And I think that needs to just be dispensed with. What's in the mind of God, again, even if God wanted and tried and succeeded in giving us everything in the mind of God, we're not going to be able to process that. The Bible's a very selective, focused, intelligently crafted book. It accomplishes the purposes to which God wanted it to succeed. And so I think we just need to think better about what was the point in even producing the thing. In 1997, I was listening to the CNN press conference for the 50th anniversary. And again, I had read enough about Roswell to know, the basic framework of the story and what the issues were. And at the CNN conference, that was being conducted by a guy named Colonel Haynes from the Air Force. And this was the Air Force's third explanation for Roswell, which alone tells you something. But a reporter at the press conference asked Colonel Haynes, he said, well, Colonel Haynes, the Air Force has reported here that the bodies, the so-called bodies that were found at Roswell, the crash site, were actually Air Force test dummies. But the report of the Air Force itself notes that these test dummies were not used until the early 1950s. So how do you explain that? Because of the event in 1947. And what I thought the colonel would say is, well, yeah, that's a typo. I misspoke, thank you. And then here's the real answer. But he didn't. He stuck to the report. He said, yes, that's correct. And the reporter's like, well, how, everybody, we're sitting here in 1997. It's the 50th anniversary. So how do those two things go together? And the colonel actually said, and I went out and got the transcript from the CNN conference right after I heard it because I couldn't believe it. He said, well, we think that the witnesses to the Roswell event have undergone time compression. And he's like, what's that? and what the colonel meant was, well, we think that these witnesses thought that they were recalling something from 1947, but it was actually something that happened in the early 1950s, which is where you get the crash test dummies, into the picture. And I listened to that and I thought, that answer is so ridiculous. Somebody somewhere wants this myth to live, because we're not talking 4 or 5 people. When it comes down to the Roswell event, you're talking about a couple hundred, and the event itself was in newspapers across the country. Mm-hmm. Picked it up from the Roswell, Daily Record, and it was so absurd to offer this as an explanation that was the only conclusion I could draw, and that really sucked me into the whole thing. Because when I heard that, I thought, I want to know. I want to know why somebody here, we have an Air Force colonel, who I imagine, showed up for work that day and got a phone call from a general that said, son, you're going to go out today and serve your country no matter how dumb you sound. like this is what you're going to say. Take one for the team. Like somebody somewhere wants this myth to live. And I was just sort of fascinated by why. Again, I think in hindsight, this is a convenient and effective, and I'll use the word important, misdirection to people within the military-industrial complex. They had their reasons for doing what they did, and again, looking stupid like this, that were important. But for the sake of the facade, I didn't want to miss that, because that was sort of a watershed moment for me that took me from sort of a casual interest to, there's just something here that needs to be thought about, needs to be understood. Since I had not done it before, and what I did for the facade, and I actually did this for the portent, the sequel as well, every scene I played through my head like I was watching a movie. So there were times, not so much with the facade because I had these big chunks of time, but for the second one, my wife could tell you, there were times I went and I sat down at the desk and I just sat there for an hour, and that was the time I had, and we're done now. But it was productive because I had now seen the scene, 5, 6, 10 times. I know who's in the room. I know who's saying what. I know who hears something and who doesn't hear something. I know how they hear. Again, you play it through your head so that the next night I can sit down and just rattle the whole thing out, because I had played it and replayed it again and again and again. And that's essentially what I do. If this were a movie, what would I be looking at? What would I be watching? And trying to pay attention to all those sorts of details. I actually like fiction more, but I also think it's harder because, with nonfiction, you're not making stuff up. You're doing research, you pull this or that out, you do the work ahead of time, the lay of the land, that sort of thing. With fiction, that isn't the case. Now, I've actually had two different experiences here. With the facade, I actually outlined the entire book before I really got into it. And then I would, again, like I said, I would play each scene in my head. So I sort of knew from the very beginning what was going to happen, how everything was going to unfold. Now, there were changes, because it's true, when you write fiction, your characters sort of take over the story. And so I would get to points in my outline and just know, nah, Melissa wouldn't do that. She wouldn't say that. There's no way Brian would do, So then it would change. Now, for the portent, though, I didn't have that luxury. I knew segments, I knew scenes, and so the issue was how to connect them. And that was more of an ad hoc thing, at least in part, just because of my circumstances where I had to approach that. I mean, playing it through my head, that's consistent. But as far as kind of knowing precisely where things were going, I didn't so much in the portent. That was a slower part of the process. So that's difficult, because it does force you to redo scenes. I don't want this person in the room, or let me change one word here that will affect the way, what the reader is thinking, because you're always trying to make the reader think a certain thought, either correctly or in terms of misdirection. There are always drifts to catch. And you want to lay the breadcrumb trail for when they get to the end and they think, well, how in the world? And then they go back and, okay, I know what was going on here. That's really difficult, much more difficult in my experience than, cranking out a conference paper or something like that. Like, academic journals do not get put on the internet. So, it's just a fallacy. We tend to believe that God only is working in the spectacular. And I think that's very contrary to biblical thinking. God is always at work, and it's typically the unseen hand that really, really matters.
If you're not already subscribed, why not hit that subscribe button right down there? While you're at it, give us a little bit of love with that thumbs up. And of course, as always, make sure you hit that share button. Share this little video with any friends or family members that you think might benefit from or enjoy watching this video as well. Hope to see you here next time. And until next time, remember, Yeshua, Jesus loves you. And so on. Now get off of here, go ride your bike, stop reading all this hogwash, and go read your Bible.